In the corporate world, empty buzzwords can cost you everything. My new boss, Bryce, fired me to steal my project, calling my work obsolete. He replaced my secure architecture with cheap garbage to impress the board. He had no idea the core system was designed to lock out greedy fools exactly like him. With one single email sent before I walked out the door, I burned his entire career to the ground in exactly 48 hours. Listen closely. Hello to the amazing audience of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep bringing you these tales of corporate justice. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive, true stories that are longer, far more detailed, and feature multiple emotional voice actors bringing to life situations we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join our community by scanning the QR code right there on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into the incredible story of a woman named Ella Green. I am 34 years old, and until a fateful Friday afternoon, I was the lead data architect at Novartis CareTech, a prominent healthcare technology firm right in the bustling heart of Chicago. The corporate world is a strange ecosystem where the people who do the actual work are constantly at the mercy of those who merely talk about working. I learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible inside our familiar, cold, glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. Sitting directly across from me was Bryce. Bryce was our newly appointed Vice President of Innovation, a title that sounded incredibly important but practically meant absolutely nothing. He was a man composed entirely of corporate artifice. He wore a sharply tailored bespoke suit that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was heavily slicked back with a glossy gel that caught the harsh fluorescent lights, and his teeth were unnervingly white. But the worst thing about Bryce was his vocabulary. He never just spoke. He vomited a continuous stream of hollow business jargon. Every sentence out of his mouth was aggressively peppered with words like optimize, disrupt, leverage, and agile. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepled his manicured fingers, and looked down at the comprehensive technical report I had submitted days earlier. He let out a loud, performative sigh. "Ella," he began, employing that deeply patronizing, overly gentle tone that weak managers use when they are about to ruin your life. "I have spent the morning doing a deep dive into the medical data routing architecture you have been overseeing, and frankly, we need to pivot. The system you built is entirely too bulky. It is rigid. In the landscape of modern tech agility, I have to be completely honest with you. Your work is obsolete." He let the word hang in the chilled air of the conference room. Obsolete. It was a calculated insult designed to break my spirit. He went on a lengthy tangent about how my defensive programming protocols were slowing down his so-called hyper-growth vision for the company's future. But I did not hear a visionary leader looking out for the best interests of a healthcare firm. I heard exactly what was really happening. I knew the truth hidden behind his polished veneer. Novartis CareTech was merely weeks away from a massive, highly lucrative corporate merger. Bryce desperately needed a monumental, flashy achievement to present to the board of directors so he could cement his own power and secure a massive bonus. The easiest way for a manager to simulate success is to ruthlessly cut costs. My custom-built, heavily encrypted medical routing system was the gold standard for patient privacy, but it was expensive to maintain. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bryce wanted to kick me out, completely remove me from the core project I had dedicated my entire youth to building, and steal the credit for my department's success. His grand master plan was to rip out my secure architecture and lazily replace it with a dangerously cheap, open-source artificial intelligence platform. By doing this, he could proudly march into the boardroom and declare that he had single-handedly slashed our operational budget by millions of dollars. He was perfectly willing to gamble with the private medical records of thousands of patients just to polish his own resume. He stopped talking, waiting for the explosion. He expected a massive fight, He expected me to shout, to passionately defend the thousands of hours I had poured into the company, or perhaps even to break down and cry, begging for my livelihood. He wanted a reaction so he could justify his decision and label me as overly emotional and unprofessional. I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on my lap, and silently observed his pathetic, arrogant theatrical performance. I looked at him not as a boss, but as a foolish trespasser blindly wandering into a minefield. Slightly unnerved by my complete silence, Bryce awkwardly cleared his throat and pushed a thick manila folder across the smooth glass table. Inside was my official termination paper, neatly clipped to an incredibly strict non-disclosure agreement. Sign the NDA, and you will receive a standard 2-month severance package, he said, trying to regain his posture of absolute authority. If you refuse, well, we will have our legal team handle the exit. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy metal pen resting next to the folder. I knew the intricate digital labyrinth of Novaris CareTech better than I knew the back of my own hand. I knew exactly what would happen the second an unauthorized, incompetent user tried to gut the central nervous system I had carefully programmed. Let him have his empty victory today. Let him play his dangerous game of corporate disruption. Without uttering a single word of protest, I smoothly signed my name on the dotted lines, closed the folder, handed it back to his waiting hands, and simply gave him a slight, knowing nod. He snatched the non-disclosure agreement and slid it into his desk drawer with a sickeningly triumphant grin. I need all global administrator credentials transferred to my new technical team by 5 o'clock today, he instructed, his voice dripping with forced casualness. I stared at him, letting the sheer absurdity of his command hang in the heavy air of the conference room. In the high-stakes realm of healthcare cybersecurity, a system migration of this monumental scale legally and practically requires a rigorous 30-day transition timeline. You do not simply toss over the master keys to petabytes of highly sensitive patient medical histories in a single afternoon. A proper handover involves extensive security audits, manual key rotations, and a gradual, heavily monitored transfer of digital privileges to ensure zero disruption in patient care. To demand an immediate, brute force takeover is the equivalent of performing open-heart surgery with a sledgehammer. It is beyond negligent. It is corporate suicide. But I did not argue. I did not waste my breath citing the strict federal compliance manuals, nor did I warn him about the catastrophic legal liabilities he was blindly inviting. To fight him would only stroke his fragile ego and validate his newfound authority. Instead, I gave him exactly what he asked for. I nodded slowly, stood up from the glass table, and walked back to my workstation with measured, deliberate steps. What Bryce utterly failed to comprehend was that true digital security is never just a passive wall. It is an active, living defense mechanism. When I built the core routing architecture for Novaris CareTech, I did not just design it to keep external hackers out. I designed it to protect the patients from internal stupidity, buried deep within the foundational code, operating quietly in the background. I had programmed a highly sophisticated dead man switch. It was an automated, military-grade fail-safe protocol. The logic was beautifully simple, yet devastatingly absolute. If a top-tier administrator account was suddenly and forcibly stripped of its access privileges without the manual input of a highly specific cryptographic handover verification code, the system would immediately perceive it as a hostile internal breach. It would autonomously trigger a complete, localized lockdown. The defense mechanism would instantly encrypt every single byte of data, slamming shut every digital door to protect the vulnerable medical records inside. Without that specific handover code, the system would turn into an impenetrable digital fortress. I sat down in my ergonomic chair for the very last time. The open-plan office around me was humming with the usual Friday afternoon chatter, my colleagues completely oblivious to the digital bomb resting directly under their feet. I opened my mail client and began to compose my final communication. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with cold, practiced precision. I addressed the message directly to Bryce, but the true brilliance of my trap lay in the carbon copy field. I deliberately copied the head of human resources and the chief legal officer. By doing so, I created an indestructible time-stamped legal paper trail securely lodged on the company server. The subject line was left entirely blank. The body of the email contained absolutely no pleasantries, no passive-aggressive remarks, and zero emotion. It was as cold and sterile as a surgical scalpel. I attached the thick, comprehensive technical manuals and typed one single, uncompromising sentence. Require the company to strictly execute the Level 4 security protocol handover per Section 9.2 to prevent automatic data lockdown risks. That was the entire message. It was the ultimate trap, perfectly disguised as a mundane administrative reminder. I was handing him the manual to disarm the bomb, knowing full well he would never bother to read it. I clicked send. I stood up and began packing my personal belongings into a standard brown cardboard box. Through the transparent glass walls of his newly claimed corner office, I observed Bryce. He was already leaning back in his chair, his feet arrogantly propped up on his mahogany desk, rapidly scrolling through his inbox on his expensive smartphone. I saw the exact moment my message arrived. His brow furrowed for a fraction of a second. He read the preview text on his screen, let out a visible, dismissive scoff, and swiped left. He hit delete without even opening the attached documents. In his limitless, blinding arrogance, he assumed my formal warning was merely the pathetic, complicated bluff of a bitter, obsolete employee trying to desperately cling to her lost power. I placed my favorite ceramic coffee mug, a few framed landscape photographs, and my noise-canceling headphones into the box. I handed my corporate laptop and my plastic security badge over to the nervously hovering IT technician Bryce had sent to monitor my departure. I walked down the long, brightly lit hallways, my footsteps echoing softly against the carpet. I rode the elevator down to the grand lobby in complete silence. The heavy revolving doors pushed me out onto the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. A freezing, biting wind whipped off Lake Michigan, stinging my cheeks and rustling my heavy coat, but I did not shiver. Instead, a slow, deeply genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my company-issued mobile phone, and held the power button down until the screen went entirely black. I severed the connection. The eerie silence of the cold afternoon was beautiful. The storm was gathering right above their heads, and I was already walking away. Monday morning arrived with the kind of aggressive, over-the-top corporate fanfare that only a deeply insecure executive could orchestrate. Bryce had completely transformed the main executive boardroom on the top floor into a theatrical stage. He invited the entire board of directors, several key venture capitalist partners, and the senior stakeholders from the impending corporate merger. They sat around the massive mahogany table, sipping sparkling water, waiting to be dazzled. Bryce stood at the front of the room, wearing a fresh, impeccably tailored power suit. Armed with a sleek wireless presentation remote, he was radiating a sickening level of smugness. He was ready to unveil his miraculous, cost-saving platform and publicly claim the glory for modernizing the company infrastructure. But 20 minutes before stepping onto that pristine stage, Bryce had committed his final, fatal error. Down in the heavily air-conditioned server control room, he had cornered the new technical team. These were the cheap, underqualified contractors he had hired to replace my senior engineers. They were sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights, staring blankly at the complex, interwoven layers of my legacy code. They were completely out of their depth, and they knew it. Bryce paced behind them, ignoring their panicked expressions. "I do not care about the firewall configurations," he barked at the lead technician, a young man whose hands were visibly shaking over the keyboard. "Delete her account entirely. Wipe her global administrator profile from the Active Directory right now, and force the new open-source module to overwrite the core data pathways. We need the new dashboard live for the investors." The young technician hesitated, his eyes darting frantically across the screen. "Sir, The system is throwing up a massive red flag. There are multiple encrypted dependencies tied to her specific administrative identity. If we force a brute force overwrite without the proper cryptographic handover keys, we risk corrupting the root directory. Bryce slammed his open palm onto the metal desk, making the technician physically jump. Do I pay you to argue with me? Or do I pay you to type, "We have billionaires sitting upstairs waiting to see a live data integration. I promise them a fully optimized, agile platform. Force the overwrite immediately to catch up on the schedule, or I will fire you right here and find someone who actually knows how to follow instructions." Intimidated, terrified of losing a lucrative contract, and lacking the backbone to stand up to a bully, the technician swallowed hard. He bypassed the safety warnings. He typed the fatal override commands. He pressed enter. Deep within the freezing, humming racks of the central data center, the digital architecture I had meticulously crafted over the years felt the violent, unauthorized intrusion. It detected a brute force overwrite command originating from an unverified terminal, violently attempting to rip out the central nervous system of the entire network. The defensive programming paused for exactly 1 microsecond. It rapidly scanned the master security log, desperately searching for the unique, encrypted handover verification code. It was looking for the exact code that I had outlined in the security manual, the very manual attached to the email Bryce had callously deleted, finding absolutely nothing but a hostile breach. The system correctly identified a massive-scale, catastrophic cyber attack from an internal threat. The dead man's switch woke up. It did not hesitate. It did not ask for secondary confirmation. It simply executed its final, lethal, and irreversible directive. A wave of military-grade encryption cascaded outward through the network at the speed of light. It swept through the local Chicago servers, surged up through our cloud relays, and slammed directly into the localized databases of over 500 partner hospitals scattered across the entire nation. The digital steel doors slammed shut. In a matter of milliseconds, millions of critical patient medical records, real-time surgical telemetry, and complex pharmaceutical routing pipelines were locked inside an impenetrable vault. The core swallowed the digital key, scrambled its own lock, and went entirely dark. Upstairs in the luxurious boardroom, Bryce was utterly oblivious to the silent, invisible apocalypse that had just detonated beneath his highly polished Italian leather shoes. He was pacing the length of the room, wildly gesturing with his hands, absolutely intoxicated by his own supply of corporate buzzwords. "What you are about to see, gentlemen," Bryce declared to the mesmerized board of directors, his voice echoing with absolute triumph, "is the ultimate future of agile healthcare management. We have stripped away the rigid, obsolete frameworks of the past. We have created a frictionless, hyper-optimized data ecosystem that will accelerate our growth tenfold." He turned dramatically toward the massive, wall-to-wall presentation screen, fully expecting a beautiful, sleek dashboard of live, flowing data to appear. He confidently clicked his wireless remote. For 1 agonizing second, the giant screen went completely, pitch black. Then, instead of the minimalist graphs and charts he expected, the massive display violently flashed a blinding, blood-red hue. The sheer intensity of the light bathed the entire executive boardroom, the faces of the investors, and Bryce himself in an ominous, glowing crimson. A loud, jarring error buzzer echoed from the ceiling speakers. Giant, stark white letters materialized across the center of the bleeding screen. "Access denied, system locked due to protocol violation." Bryce froze mid-stride. The arrogant, triumphant smile quite literally melted off his face, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. His jaw dropped. He frantically clicked his remote again. Nothing happened. He rushed to the podium, his hands trembling violently as he desperately smashed the keys on the laptop. The glaring red warning remained on the screen, completely immovable, mocking his profound ignorance. The room full of powerful investors, venture capitalists, and senior executives fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The air grew instantly freezing. The grand presentation had just become the most spectacular public execution in the history of the company. Within seconds of that red screen illuminating the boardroom, the fragile illusion of corporate control violently shattered. Down on the second floor, the main customer support hub erupted into absolute pandemonium. Hundreds of telephone lines began flashing and ringing simultaneously, creating a deafening, chaotic symphony of panicked alarms. Partner medical facilities from coast to coast were abruptly slamming into an impenetrable digital wall. Emergency room physicians were entirely locked out of critical, life-or-death patient histories. Pharmacists could not verify essential, life-saving prescriptions. In several major cities, active surgical wards were forced to halt mid-operation because real-time blood and telemetry routing had gone entirely blind. Nurses resorted to frantic scribbling on physical whiteboards. We were not merely dropping packets of data, we were actively endangering human lives across the country. The sheer scale of the disaster was unfathomable. The chief executive officer of Novartis CareTech, a man who usually projected an aura of icy, untouchable calm, practically ripped the heavy oak door of his private office off its solid hinges. He summoned Bryce immediately. He did not invite him. He demanded him. As Bryce scurried into the room, the CEO slammed his clenched fists down onto his polished desk so violently that his ceramic coffee cup shattered, sending hot liquid pooling across important documents. "Fix this right now," the chief executive roared, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "Do you have any earthly idea what you have just done to us? We are facing thousands of federal health insurance portability and accountability act violations per single minute. The fines alone will reach hundreds of millions of dollars. If those servers are not completely unlocked and operational by tomorrow morning, this entire company will be bankrupt before the end of the week. The $10 billion merger is entirely dead in the water. You have killed us." Bryce was practically hyperventilating. His exceptionally expensive suit was now thoroughly soaked in cold, terrified sweat. His silk tie was askew, and his perfectly styled hair had devolved into a tangled, greasy mess. The walls of the corporate empire he thought he conquered were rapidly closing in to crush him. In a state of pure, cowardly desperation, he decided to play his final, most despicable card. He chose to lie. He looked his furious boss dead in the very eyes and spun a vile, completely fabricated narrative to save his own skin. "It was not me," Bryce stammered, pointing a violently trembling finger toward the empty air. "It was Ella Green. She was absolutely furious about the departmental restructuring on Friday. She must have intentionally planted a malicious logic bomb, a retaliatory virus deep inside the mainframe before she walked out of the building. She is trying to destroy everything. This is deliberate corporate sabotage. She is a domestic terrorist." It was exactly the narrative the desperate executives needed to hear. They urgently required a convenient scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic legal fallout and miraculously save the impending corporate merger. Within one single hour, the sleek corporate headquarters resembled an active, high-stakes crime scene. Dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles aggressively surrounded the glass building. Special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked closely by elite cyber operatives from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, stormed through the main lobby. They rapidly confiscated every piece of hardware, isolated the local networks, cloned the primary mainframes, and established a rapid response digital forensics command center right in the middle of the marketing department. They were intensely hunting for the smoking gun, desperately searching for the malicious, destructive virus I had supposedly unleashed upon the public. But as the long, agonizing hours ticked by, the Federal Cyber Unit did not find a chaotic, destructive computer worm. They found absolutely nothing resembling illegal sabotage. As the lead technical agent meticulously unpacked the densely encrypted source code, a profound sense of confusion, followed by quiet realization, washed over him. He called the panicked chief executive officer and a trembling Bryce back down into the freezing server room. "There is absolutely no malware here," the senior federal agent stated. his voice incredibly flat, authoritative, and uncompromising. There is no logic bomb hidden in the architecture. There is no unauthorized code injection of any kind. Bryce immediately started to stammer out an argument, but the federal agent cut him off abruptly with a sharp raise of his hand. "What we are looking at," the agent continued, tapping the heavy protective screen of his diagnostic laptop, "is a brilliantly engineered, completely legal data protection module. It is fully documented, properly patented, and entirely compliant with federal medical security standards. The system simply recognized an unauthorized, deeply hostile internal takeover attempt and flawlessly executed a standard, pre-programmed defense protocol. Whoever forcefully pulled the trigger on this system overright today is the sole individual who caused this catastrophic crisis, not the architect who originally built the lock." I was miles away from the chaos, sitting comfortably on my living room sofa with a hot cup of tea. But the official federal deposition transcripts and internal server logs provided to my legal counsel months later painted a crystal-clear picture of the beautiful, methodical execution of my trap. I know exactly how the walls closed in on them. The senior federal agent did not simply take Bryce at his word. In high-stakes federal investigations involving critical national healthcare infrastructure, verbal accusations mean absolutely nothing. Evidence is the only currency that matters. The lead investigator turned away from the trembling vice president and faced the sweating chief legal officer and the head of human resources, who were hovering nervously near the flashing server racks. "I require immediate, unhindered access to the complete, unedited communication history between Mr. Bryce and Miss Ella Green leading up to her termination," the agent commanded, his voice echoing sharply in the cold room. "If she planted a retaliatory trap, there will be a digital behavioral trail. We need to see every single email, instant message, and internal corporate memo exchanged over the last 30 days. The forensic team bypassed the completely locked mainframe and swiftly accessed the heavily guarded redundant backup servers. It did not take them days or even hours to uncover the absolute truth. It took them exactly 12 minutes. The lead federal technician pulled up the master exchange log and projected it onto the secondary wall monitor for the entire executive leadership team to witness. There, glowing brightly against the dark digital background, was the undeniable, ironclad proof of my complete innocence. It was the single, emotionally barren email I had sent right before walking out the revolving glass doors. The very same email I had brilliantly carbon copied to the legal and human resources departments, securely anchoring it into the permanent corporate record. The federal agent read the timestamp aloud to the silent room. "Sent on Friday at exactly 4:45 in the afternoon." He clicked open the message. The massive screen displayed my strict, uncompromising directive for all to see. "Require the company to strictly execute the Level 4 security protocol handover per Section 9.2 to prevent automatic data lockdown risks." The agent clicked on the heavy digital attachment, revealing the comprehensive, 200-page technical manual detailing the exact cryptography handover procedure Bryce was legally obligated to follow. It was a flawless, airtight warning. I had explicitly told them the gun was fully loaded, pointed it directly at their own heads, and provided the exact instruction manual on how to safely unload it. The chief executive officer slowly turned his gaze toward Bryce. The look in the older man's eyes was one of pure, unadulterated fury. But the federal investigator was not quite finished tightening the noose around the corrupt manager's neck. "Now, let us examine the internal recipient logs," the agent said, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm, methodical register. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, isolating Bryce's specific user activity history from that fateful Friday afternoon. The internal server never lies. The digital footprint was devastatingly precise and entirely unforgiving. "The server confirms receipt of the warning email at 4:45 and 12 seconds. The agent read from the glowing screen. The message was marked as opened, and at 4:45 and 15 seconds, the user manually moved the message and its critical attachments directly to the permanent trash folder. 3 seconds. You ignored a critical, legally mandated security warning involving millions of private medical records after looking at it for exactly 3 seconds. The truth violently detonated inside the freezing server control room. There was no malicious external hacker. There was no disgruntled, vengeful employee seeking to destroy the firm. There was only the monumental, earth-shattering arrogance of a man who genuinely thought he knew better than the architect who built the entire ecosystem. I was completely, undeniably innocent. I had followed every single rule, adhered to every government protocol, and covered my legal liabilities perfectly. Bryce had not just destroyed the central nervous system of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare company by attempting to aggressively frame me. He had crossed a terrifying, irreversible legal threshold. "You stood in this room," the federal agent said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the hyperventilating vice president. "And you explicitly, intentionally lied to a federal officer during an active national security cyber investigation. That is a direct violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1001. You have committed a severe felony today. You are looking at a minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary just for the false statements alone." Bryce physically collapsed against the cold metal casing of the server rack, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the anti-static floor. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He buried his pale face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper that echoed through the quiet room. He had single-handedly pushed Novartis CareTech to the absolute brink of permanent operational license suspension. But the true horror was not over for the remaining corporate executives. The ultimate paralyzing nightmare finally dawned on the chief legal officer. The remaining color completely drained from his aged face as his eyes widened in sheer, uncontrollable panic. He grabbed the chief executive officer tightly by the arm, his fingernails digging deep into the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. "The cryptography," the chief legal officer whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "If this is a legally patented, closed-loop defensive algorithm, there is absolutely no backdoor override. The federal government cannot brute force a military-grade encryption sequence without permanently corrupting and destroying the underlying patient data. There is only one unique biometric master key in existence." The circle of powerful executives exchanged terrified, desperate glances as the crushing, inescapable weight of reality settled heavily upon their shoulders. The only person on the entire planet who held the legal authority, the technical capability, and the precise mathematical key to unlock the blazing red screens across 500 desperate hospitals was the exact same woman they had arrogantly thrown out onto the freezing streets of Chicago just 48 hours ago. They were completely helplessly at my mercy. I was miles away from the glaring fluorescent lights and the suffocating panic of the corporate headquarters. It was a beautiful, crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting comfortably by the large bay window of a quiet, rustic coffee shop nestled deep in the Chicago suburbs. I had a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee in one hand and a thick, engrossing paperback novel in the other. I was thoroughly enjoying the peaceful rhythm of my newfound early retirement. The delicate brass bell above the cafe entrance chimed softly. I did not need to look up to know who had arrived. The heavy, frantic footsteps belonging to men who were entirely out of options gave them away. The chief executive officer and the chief legal officer of Novartis CareTech stood before my small wooden table. They looked absolutely ruined. Just 48 hours ago, these men were the untouchable titans of the healthcare tech industry. Now, their expensive designer suits were terribly wrinkled. Their eyes were bloodshot from a complete lack of sleep, and they were sweating profusely despite the cool autumn air. They had been forced to swallow every last ounce of their monumental pride, personally driving out of the city to hunt down the only person capable of stopping their empire from burning to the ground. The chief executive officer pulled up a chair without asking and leaned in close, his voice trembling with a mixture of pure exhaustion and sheer desperation. He practically begged me to come back. He offered me my old job title, a significant salary increase, and a heartfelt public apology. I carefully placed my leather bookmark between the pages of my novel, closed the book, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I let the agonizing silence stretch out, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable reality of their own making. "I have absolutely no interest in returning as your employee," I finally stated, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. "I do not work for you anymore. However, I am willing to offer my services as an independent crisis resolution consultant. My contract is extremely simple. I require a flat consulting fee of $2 million. That amount is to be wired directly into my private holding account before I even touch a keyboard. Furthermore, there is one final, entirely non-negotiable operational condition that we will address when we get to the office." The chief legal officer flinched at the staggering financial demand, but the chief executive officer did not even blink. He immediately pulled out his mobile phone, dialed his banking director, and authorized the $2 million transfer on the spot. They had zero leverage, and they both knew it. An hour later, I was walking back through the towering glass doors of the Novaris CareTech headquarters. The building felt like a digital graveyard. The federal agents and cybersecurity teams silently parted ways to let me pass. I walked straight up to the executive floor and stepped right into the familiar glass-walled conference room. It was the exact same room where I had been ruthlessly discarded just 2 days prior. The atmosphere inside was incredibly heavy. Sitting completely frozen in the far corner of the massive mahogany table was Bryce. The arrogant, slick-talking vice president was entirely gone. His face was the color of dirty ash. He was physically curled in on himself, his shoulders hunched, completely incapable of making eye contact with me or anyone else in the room. He looked pathetic. I walked over to the head of the table, pulling out the plush leather chair. I unzipped my bag, slowly pulled out my personal laptop, and placed it on the glass surface. I opened the lid. The bright screen illuminated my face. Every single person in the room held their breath, waiting for me to type the salvation code. Instead, I rested my hands flat on the table, turned my head, and looked directly at the chief executive officer. "My final condition," I said, my voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "Bryce is to be terminated right here, right this very second, with absolute prejudice. He is to be permanently stripped of all invested equity and stock options. Furthermore, I want your building security team to physically escort him out of this facility immediately. While I watch, if he is still breathing the air inside this room in 60 seconds, I will close my laptop, walk out that door, and let your entire company drown." Bryce let out a quiet, suffocated gasp, finally looking up with wide, terrified eyes. But the chief executive officer did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He pressed a button on his desk phone. 2 massive, broad-shouldered security guards entered the glass room instantly. They marched straight toward Bryce, grabbed him roughly by the arms of his ruined suit, and hauled him to his feet. "Wait, please, you cannot do this to me," Bryce stammered, his voice cracking pitifully as they dragged him toward the heavy glass doors. "I was just trying to optimize the workflow, please." Nobody answered him. The chief executive officer looked away in disgust. The guards dragged the sobbing, broken manager down the long hallway. We all listened in complete silence as his desperate pleas faded away, entirely silenced by the heavy metallic thud of the elevator doors sliding shut. His career, his reputation, and his entire future were permanently buried, never to be resurrected. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly clean. I turned my attention back to my glowing screen. I brought up the master terminal interface. With calm, practiced precision, I typed a single, beautifully simple command consisting of exactly 12 characters. I hit the enter key. Instantly, the terrifying red alarms flashing on the monitors outside the glass room vanished. A cascading wave of soothing, brilliant green lights swept across the server dashboards. The military-grade encryption dissolved. The digital vault doors swung wide open, and the massive flow of vital medical data rushed back to the 500 desperate hospitals across the nation. The crisis was officially over. I calmly closed my laptop, packed it back into my bag, and stood up. I looked down at the chief executive officer, allowing a slow, razor-sharp smile to finally cross my face. It seems I am not so obsolete after all, I whispered. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey into corporate justice satisfying, please consider supporting our work by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. By joining, you get exclusive access to the absolute best, most intense true revenge stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the quick response code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and stay tuned for more.